Okay, everybody. So we're going to now go into our last three talks before the poster session. And the first one will be on emergence of grid-like representations by training recurrent neural networks to perform spatial localization.
All right, so moving through the environment is obviously very important for many animals. And so over the last 50 years, researchers have probed the neural representations of space. And they found cells whose neural activity varies in interesting ways as an animal wanders around an environment. In 2014, some of this work was even recognized with the Nobel Prize, but I think it's still fair to say that even though these cells are modulated by spatial location, it's an open question as to what the function of these cells really is. So here's an idealized example of one of these interesting cells. This illustration shows a rat in a two-dimensional environment. So the black lines are a record of the rat's position over time, and the blue circles highlight the locations where a grid cell would increase its neural activity. Here's the actual firing rate of a grid cell coded as a heat map. So red is more spikes and blue is no spikes. And the first question that pops out is, why is this cell firing at the corners of a triangular lattice? You know, it seems weird. And so this project really began with a simple question, which is, what are grid cells doing in the brain? And there are other interesting spatial tuning patterns seen during navigation. And so it'd be nice if we could fit all of these observations together into some consistent framework. So here are some examples of other cells whose neural activity depends on spatial location. There are cells that fire at the borders of environment, cells that have band-like firing fields, and of course there are the irregular cells that don't fit into any of these cute categories. And we would like to understand what function all of these cells are serving. So it's worth noting that grid cells are not just some idiosyncratic feature of rat navigation, but they've been observed in many animals, including mice, bats, monkeys, and humans. So there's something universal here that we can try to understand. So how are we going to study these cells? Well, I'd like a model that doesn't have any spatial tuning built in, so no grid cells, border cells, et cetera. I don't want to have to make a priori assumptions about what cell types are connected to what other cell types. And I'd really like these cell types to just emerge naturally as a result of solving some task. And this would then suggest some function for these various cell types. So here's the game plan. We're going to pick a task that requires spatial navigation. We're going to create an artificial neural network to solve the task. And then we're either going to adjust the task or the constraints on the neural network such that grid cells, border cells, et cetera, emerge naturally as this network learns to perform the task. I'm going to use a recurrent neural network, and this is in contrast to a lot of beautiful work that's been done explaining the visual system with feed-forward networks. And the reason I'm using a recurrent neural network is these feedback loops give it the computational power of memory. And this is important for navigation because imagine I receive some vestibular input that says, I've just turned right 90 degrees and taken 20 steps, and now I want to know where I am without looking around. I'm going to have the wrong answer if I can't remember what direction I was initially facing and where I was located. So the specific task I'm going to consider is a simple one. It's dead reckoning, sometimes referred to as path integration. So the inputs are a moment-by-moment speed and direction, and the network is going to tell me its XY location. And importantly, the speed input will sometimes be 0 as the noise is added to the network. So the network must learn to sort of stably store these memories in the face of noise. So the inputs and outputs of this task are a bit abstracted from the messy details of biology, but I think there are a few reasons this is a reasonable place to start. We chose speed and direction as inputs, as there are a number of papers over the years showing that the brain contains cells tuned for head direction and speed, and that these are necessary for grid formation. And dead reckoning is a task that humans perform. So it captures some of the fundamental aspects of navigation, updating your current estimate of location as you receive new information. So basically, we're going to start with this simple model, and we're just going to see how far we can get. So the way I'm going to get the neural network to perform this task is by adjusting all of these arrows, the connection weights between the units. So one unit could excite another unit, and the weight would be positive, or 2 units might not be connected, in which case the weight is 0. The output is just going to be a linear combination of the neural activity in the units. And in all of the neural network models I'll show you, I only ask the network to produce the correct outputs as I train it with gradient descent. I don't specify how the network should solve the task, or place constraints on what the network activity should look like. And there's one exception to this, which was crucial, and that was the neural activity was encouraged to be small. In other words, there was a penalization on the metabolic cost of the neural activity. So this is one example output from the network, and this is the activity of 4 out of the 100 units in the neural network while it's generating this output. And for future reference, it's worth remembering the following little bit of information, that the environmental boundary only enters this model through the changing input statistics at the boundary. So in other words, if the network is up at the top, a boundary, it can't head any further north, and so its options for heading and speed will be constrained and change in the presence of the boundary. Okay, so now that we have a network performing some spatial navigation task, let's look at the spatial tuning of individual units and compare them to the responses that we saw earlier in the actual data. So here's the activity of 4 units with simple border responses, and just like when we were looking at the electrode recordings, each plot shows the average neural activity of a single unit as a function of position in the square environment. So yellow indicates the unit has a large response, so this unit up here, likes the top, and unit 2 has high activity along the bottom edge of the environment. There we go. And here are some similar border responses observed experimentally. So, good start. The model also contains units with band-like responses, and encouragingly, we again see similar responses in the brain. All right, and now for the grid cells. So they looked multi-peaked, geometrical, and on a rectangular grid. So interestingly, there's a strong environmental dependency on the shape of the grid in this model. So here are some of the grid-like units from triangular and hexagonal environments. And as far as I know, no environmental effects this extreme have been observed in the data, but it's worth noting that these networks really have an extreme childhood. So each network has been raised in a single environmental geometry its entire life. Here's a summary of the different response profiles we've seen so far. So the grid-like band cells and border cells, and now shown when the networks are trained in 3 different environments, so the square, triangular, and hexagonal. And in addition, there are irregular units that don't fit into any of these categories. And these types of irregular spatial responses are certainly seen in the brain. And I think it's kind of fun that the variability that arises in some of these models has also been observed experimentally. So for example, here in the upper left is a cell from a rat that preferentially responds along the whole boundary of the environment. Here's a similar unit from one of the models. Cells have also been observed that fire along adjacent edges in the environment, and some of the models also develop units that are active along multiple edges. All right, so wrapping up the list of properties found in the model and data, the units in the neural network also have direction tuning and speed tuning. So these are some of the units from a network trained in a triangular environment, and we can see the spatial responses, just like we've been looking at previously. And here we see the activity of a unit plotted along the y-axis and how it varies as a function of direction and speed. And I guess it's sort of interesting to note that the units that have the most direction tuning sort of are least spatially responsive, so the network has kind of parcellated itself out into some sort of functional groups. And as we noted before, direction and speed tuning cells have been observed experimentally, so here are 2 example cells from a rat. And I'd say now we've sort of characterized the tuning properties of units in the model and shown that the neural network has some similarities to the brain, but we've only looked at the neural activity after the network has learned the task. And one of the things we can do with a model like this is we can see how these representations evolve as the model is learning the task. So here are the spatial responses of 8 example units when the model is just starting to learn this dead reckoning task. And one thing we can see is that there are no grid cells. So this is interesting because I know that the 4 units on the bottom will develop grid-like responses. So now let's let the network continue to develop, and here's the activity of the same 8 units at an intermediate stage. And we can see that the border responses of the top 4 units have stabilized. These are not going to change much as the network continues to learn the task. And now we start to see some structure in the 4 units on the bottom. So let's continue our journey through development here. And now we can really see the grid-like structure has sort of popped out. And this developmental progression is present in all the models. As the neural network learns the task, the border units appear first, and the grid-like responses with these finer spatial tuning only emerge later in training. So this developmental timeline of the grid-like cells and border cells, it's consistent with developmental studies in rodents. So the border cells appear after 2 weeks, and these grid cells appear after 4. So I want to show you one more example of this developmental progression in a neural network, because I think it's sort of suggestive that not only do the border responses appear first, but they might play a role in the development of these grid cells. So here are 6 units at an early stage of development when the model is just starting to learn the task. And like before, the bottom row of units will become grid-like, but as you can see now, there's no grid activity. So I want you to look at the top 3 units as I step forward to an intermediate stage of development. And notice that these units have stabilized with a slight tilt. And now if we look at a late stage of development, we see that the grid-like units have also formed with a tilt. So I think this example and the developmental progression in general is sort of interesting. It suggests there's some role for the boundary-related responses in grid formation. There were a couple other key components for getting these grid-like responses. So the first one is penalizing the metabolic costs of the neural activity. On the right, we see 100 spatial responses from units in a network that was encouraged to perform the task in this energetically efficient manner. And on the left, we see the responses from a network with less regularization on the metabolic cost. So the neural activity was less constrained and could be higher. And I think this is an interesting point because I would certainly guess that the brain acts efficiently, but I didn't expect this constraint to be powerful enough to change the entire spatial representation. So it's worth noting that both networks can solve the task, but the only one that sort of develops this grid-like structure is the one where the neural activity was penalized. And the second key component for getting these grid-like responses was adding noise to the neural network and really asking the network to preserve its memory in the face of this noise. So to wrap up, these networks have a diverse set of tuning properties that qualitatively match some of the cell types observed experimentally, although there's certainly still work to be done getting grid cells at many spatial scales. And in our model, the boundaries of the environment seem to be a crucial factor for the emergence of these rich spatial representations. During development, the change in input statistics around the boundary is the only cue the animal receives about the bounds, with no extra tactile information being fed into the network. And this points to an interesting hypothesis that the emergence of border cells and then these grid-like cells relies on the movement statistics of the animal, and this is quite a different mechanism than what's been suggested previously. And then we also see this developmentally consistent appearance of border and grid-like responses. So in conclusion, our results suggest that grid cells, border cells, are a natural solution to representing space efficiently given the recurrent connections in the brain. So thank you for your attention.
We have time for 2 questions. You want to? You pick.
Okay.
So I noticed that all your grid cells seem to have the same, roughly the same wavelength, about 1 cycle per width in your box. The real grid cells exist on many scales, and it's thought to be important how they can represent the position. So that makes me worry that they're appearing for a different reason or they're playing a different role in representation. Have you looked into how, like which cells are active at one point and how they combine to actually specify that?
Yeah, I definitely think that's, that's sort of on the list of things because, right now this could just sort of be, an interesting toy model that, doesn't have a strong enough grounding. But I think there's a lot of reasons this model doesn't have different spatial scales. So for one, all of the units sort of are tuned with the same time scales. They're all interconnected. There's basically no functional segregation. So I think basically if you trained a network like this and you sort of forced a little bit of segregation, forced it to have a couple different pools, forced the units in the different pools to sort of have different time constants, so natural dynamics, I think that could help. Also, the simulation is basically all moving with the same movement statistics. So there's not a lot of variability there, and I would expect that if you introduce sort of different scales of movement variability, you also might see that reflected in the different scales in the sort of the grid patterns. So I agree, that would really make me happy. Basically, if you got the multiple grid scales, then I'd say, okay, I'm fully on board. And now I just think, oh, this is interesting, like there's something interesting here.
I was wondering if you considered what would happen if you train on one, try to generalize to another, and how that would relate to the animal.
Yeah. One thing that's probably missing in this is there's ability in animals to sort of quickly remap to a new environment. And I think that would be a little bit hard for a model like this, because it would sort of have to explore and learn the new environmental geometry. Yeah, so I haven't, fully tested it. I guess the interesting thing about this, and kind of the spirit of this sort of model, is just to see what is the simplest set of ingredients that can give rise to some of these interesting cell types. And honestly, I didn't even expect a model like this to lead to any sort of interesting behavior. So for me, it was a surprise. I already thought you're going to have external sort of boundary cues and environment things, which would also then help it deal with new environments. So maybe people in the back.
We needed to get them.
Oh, next person? All right, thanks.